The air was thick with the stench of blood and the cries of the dying. Men fell like wheat before a scythe, their armor torn and their bodies broken. In the heart of Lincoln, a city now turned into a battlefield. A group of knights charged through the narrow streets, their swords flashing in the sunlight. At the front of this charge was an old man, his armor dented and his face weary, but his spirit undaunted. This was William Marshal, the Earl of Pembroke, and this was the moment that would decide the fate of a young king and a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos. Henry III, a boy of just 9 years, had lost his father, King John, and was now the ruler of a land torn apart by rebellion and foreign invasion. The French, led by Prince Louis, had flooded into England, capturing castles and towns and threatening to dethrone the young king. The future of England hung in the balance, and it was up to a few loyal men to save it. William Marshal, despite his age, was determined to protect the young king. He had been entrusted with this sacred duty on John's deathbed, and he would not fail. As he led his knights into battle, he shouted words of encouragement, his voice hoarse but filled with a fierce resolve. "These men have seized our lands and our possessions. Shame on the man who does not strive, this very day, to put up a challenge. If we beat them, it is no lie to say that we will have one eternal glory for the rest of our lives." The fighting was brutal. Men and horses fell in heaps, the streets running red with blood. The noise was deafening, clashing swords, shattering lances, and the screams of the wounded. Marshal, in the thick of it all, fought with a strength that belied his years. He plunged his sword into the enemy lines, creating a gap that his knights quickly exploited. The air was filled with the smell of sweat, fear, and the acrid stench of death. 6 hours passed, and the fighting continued. The French, led by the Count of Perche, were relentless, but their resolve began to waver. Marshal's determination and the bravery of his knights started to turn the tide. The French lines broke, and the Count of Perche was thrown from his horse, a spear piercing his eye and ending his life. The news of the defeat at Lincoln reached Prince Louis, who was besieging Dover. He knew that his position was now untenable. The English had shown their strength, and the French prince, seeing the writing on the wall, lifted the siege and began to think of terms for withdrawal. But the war was not yet over. In August, the French suffered another crushing defeat at sea. Hubert de Burgh, a loyalist who had served the young king's father, commanded a naval victory at Sandwich. The English showered the French ships with arrows and quicklime, blinding the French sailors and causing chaos. Eustache the monk, a notorious pirate, was captured hiding in the ship's bilges. The French, humiliated and defeated, were forced to retreat. With these victories, the immediate threat to the English crown was averted. William Marshal, now regent of England, continued to guide the young king through the challenges that lay ahead. He was a man of unwavering loyalty and principle, a loyal critic of the crown who had served the great kings of his age. As he lay on his deathbed in the spring of 1219, Marshal thought of the future of the kingdom and the young king he had fought so hard to protect. He called for Henry III, now 12 years old, and took the boy's hand. "I beg the Lord our God that, if I ever did anything to please him, that in the end he grant you to grow up to be a worthy man, and if it were the case that you followed in the footsteps of some wicked ancestor, and that your wish was to be like him, then I pray to God, the Son of Mary, that you die before it comes to that." "Amen," the king replied, his voice filled with a mix of reverence and fear. The future was uncertain, but the young king had the support of men like William Marshal, who had shown that with courage and determination, even the most daunting challenges could be overcome. The road ahead was long and fraught with danger, but the kingdom had a fighting chance, and so did the boy who would one day rule it. Henry III's journey to becoming a king in his own right was a long and bumpy road. When he turned 18 in 1225, many expected him to take full control of the kingdom. However, Henry wasn't ready. He was still influenced by his advisors, especially Hubert de Burgh, who held the position of justiciar for life. De Burgh was cautious about military campaigns in France, which often clashed with Henry's ambitions. This made it hard for Henry to assert his authority. Henry's lack of confidence and his tendency to take the last piece of advice given to him made him a weak ruler. He was known for his temper, often flying into rages and even trying to attack his advisors with a blunted sword. Despite this, he rarely removed anyone from his council, which led to a lot of frustration among his barons. In 1231, things got worse when Peter des Roches, Henry's former tutor, returned from the Crusades. Des Roches and de Burgh couldn't work together, and des Roches quickly took control. He ousted de Burgh in 1232, accusing him of various crimes. De Burgh was tried and imprisoned, a move that showed the growing importance of the Magna Carta in English politics. Des Roches's rule was even more unpopular than de Burgh's. He appointed his own followers to important positions and alienated many barons. Richard Marshal, the son of the famous William Marshal, and Henry's own brother, Richard of Cornwall, rebelled against the king. The situation became so dire that by 1233, some barons were talking about deposing Henry. In 1234, the crisis reached a breaking point. The English bishops, led by the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund Rich, threatened to excommunicate Henry if he didn't remove des Roches. Henry finally took action, ordering des Roches to retire. At a council in Gloucester, Henry acknowledged the failures of his government and promised to follow the principles of the Magna Carta, consulting his barons on important decisions. Around this time, Henry also began to look to history for inspiration. He found a role model in Saint Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king. Edward's reign, marked by piety and good governance, resonated with Henry. He started to promote the cult of Saint Edward, commissioning paintings and celebrating his feast day with great zeal. This spiritual transformation seemed to give Henry a sense of purpose and direction. Henry's personal appearance and character were unique. He was about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a drooping eyelid that gave him a solemn look. He was deeply religious, even for a medieval king, and spent a lot of money on artistic and architectural projects to celebrate his kingship. He transformed Westminster and other royal palaces with paintings and buildings that depicted famous historical scenes and figures, including Saint Edward the Confessor and military saints like Saint Eustace. In 1236, Henry married Eleanor of Provence, a 12-year-old princess. This marriage was politically significant because it strengthened Henry's connections to the French court and the Holy Roman Empire. Eleanor's family, the Counts of Savoy, were influential diplomats, and her sister was married to Louis IX of France. Despite not bringing any land with her, Eleanor's marriage brought Henry valuable allies and influence in European politics. Henry's transformation from a weak and indecisive ruler to a more confident king was gradual but significant. By 1234, he was finally governing in his own right, committed to the principles of the Magna Carta and the spiritual legacy of Saint Edward the Confessor. His reign, though not without its challenges, marked a turning point in English history. Henry knew the eyes of Europe would be on him when he married his new queen at Canterbury on January 20th, 1236. The ceremony was a grand event, and the city was decorated with flags, banners, and candles. The streets were cleaned, and the citizens welcomed the king and queen with enthusiasm. The whole city was buzzing with excitement, and everyone wanted a glimpse of the royal couple. The marriage wasn't just a personal joy for Henry, it was also a strategic move. His new queen, Eleanor, brought connections to the high politics of Europe, which strengthened Henry's position. To celebrate, Henry and Eleanor took a summer trip to Glastonbury, where they visited the supposed burial site of King Arthur. This added a mystical touch to their union and excited the realm even more, but the excitement didn't stop there. In January 1238, another important marriage took place. Simon de Montfort, a rising star at Henry's court, married Henry's sister, Eleanor of Leicester. This was a big deal because Eleanor had previously taken a vow of chastity after the death of her first husband. Despite this, she chose to break her vow and marry de Montfort, a charismatic and ambitious Frenchman who had impressed the king with his political and military skills. The marriage caused a stir. The barons were upset because de Montfort's new position would give him more power and land, and the bishops were confused about Eleanor's broken vow. The situation was so tense that Henry's brother, Richard, and other nobles led an armed rebellion against the king. It took 6 months to calm things down, but eventually, de Montfort was accepted as a royal favorite and brother-in-law. Meanwhile, Henry's new queen, Eleanor, brought her Savoyard relatives to the English court. Her uncles Peter, Thomas, and Boniface were influential, and Henry was impressed by their elegance and connections. He gave them important roles, like making Peter the Lord of Richmond and Boniface the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Savoyards added a new flavor to the English aristocracy, and while not everyone liked it, they brought more to England than they took. In June 1239, the 16-year-old queen gave birth to Henry's first son, which was a huge cause for celebration. The court and the city of London rejoiced, and Henry was particular about the gifts he received, returning those he deemed unworthy. The king decided to name his son Edward after the saintly King Edward the Confessor, a name that was unusual but meaningful for Henry. He wanted his son to embody both the ancient past and the future of Plantagenet kingship. However, the joy was short-lived. At a religious ceremony for the queen after childbirth, a heated argument broke out between Henry and de Montfort. De Montfort had borrowed money from Thomas of Savoy and pledged Henry's name as a guarantor without asking, which made Henry furious. The king accused de Montfort of seducing his sister before their marriage, and the argument was so intense that de Montfort and Eleanor had to flee England. De Montfort decided to go on a crusade, and Eleanor went to Italy for safety. When de Montfort returned in 1242, Henry welcomed him back, as he needed his skills for a military expedition to Poitou. The campaign was a disaster, and Henry's poor leadership led to humiliating losses. De Montfort fought bravely, but couldn't change the outcome. The failure strained Henry's relationship with his brother Richard and de Montfort, and it was clear that tensions would rise again. On the night of October 12, 1247, Henry prepared for a special ceremony. He had obtained a vial of Christ's blood, a precious relic, and was planning to present it to Westminster Abbey. The king fasted and prayed all night, and the next morning he walked from St. Paul's Cathedral to Westminster, carrying the vial above his head. The procession was long and tiring, but Henry welcomed the discomfort as a form of devotion. When he arrived at Westminster Abbey, the church was in the early stages of a massive Gothic renovation. Henry presented the relic to the church and the community, a moment of deep religious significance. Despite the challenges and failures, Henry found solace in his piety and the support of his growing family. Henry's grand ceremony at Westminster was a dazzling display of royal pageantry. Surrounded by English knights, nobles, and bishops, Henry put on a performance that would have made the courts of Louis IX and Frederick II envious. The Bishop of Norwich gave a powerful sermon, emphasizing that Henry's relic, the supposed blood of Christ, was the most sacred in all of Europe. He praised Henry as the most Christian of all princes, saying that this invaluable treasure had been sent to England because faith and holiness flourished there more than anywhere else. This ceremony was more than just a show. It was a statement of Henry's vision of kingship. He saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a holy figure, a protector of the church and a defender of the faith. Unlike his predecessors, who often clashed with the church, Henry portrayed himself as a devoted servant of God and a guardian of the church. He spoke to England's soul and history, emphasizing the ancient Saxon lineage of the royal family and knitting his rule to the pre-conquest times. But the ceremony was only part of the story. After the grand spectacle, Henry changed out of his simple pauper's costume and donned a glittering garment made of precious cloth, woven with shining metal threads and decorated in gold. He then knighted his half-brother William de Valence and several other Poitevin and Gascon nobles, transforming from a priest-pilgrim king into a chivalric lord. Despite the grandeur of the ceremony, it did not solve Henry's political problems. In the 1240s, Henry had been working hard to create a new dynastic myth. But as the 1250s approached, he faced a series of troubles. One of the biggest issues was the situation in Gascony, a region of Henry's overseas dominions. In 1247, Simon de Montfort was sent to Gascony to manage the region and protect it from neighboring threats. At first, de Montfort did well, building alliances and securing the borders. However, he soon ran out of money and began to make enemies. He confiscated land, destroyed buildings, and even cut down vines, which was a severe punishment in a region where wine was a major source of income. By 1252, Gascony was in turmoil. Henry, frustrated, recalled de Montfort to face trial before the royal council. The trial was tense, with both sides feeling deeply hurt. The Gascons accused de Montfort of being a traitor, guilty of extortion and even starving his enemies. De Montfort, feeling betrayed, lashed out at Henry, questioning his Christian faith and accusing him of fecklessness. Henry, in turn, defended himself coldly. and the trial ended with de Montfort temporarily returning to Gascony. However, his presence there only caused more rebellion, and Henry was forced to go to Gascony himself to subdue it. He then granted the duchy to his son, Lord Edward, as a wedding gift when Edward married Eleanor of Castile in 1254. Henry's financial struggles were another major issue. He had a grand vision of restoring the Plantagenet patrimony, which included Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, but he lacked the resources to make it a reality. While Louis IX of France could afford to pay 150,000 livres for the crown of thorns and raise 1 million livres for a crusade, Henry struggled to raise enough money for even a small invasion force. His revenues from England and the profits of government, justice, and trade were enough for peacetime, but not for major wars. Henry tried to mask his financial problems with a facade of generosity and splendor. He invested heavily in architecture, art, and jewels, and he traveled in style, making lavish donations to churches and shrines. However, behind this facade, he faced a deep structural problem. He could not raise enough money to fund his foreign campaigns, so he resorted to taxing Jews, selling royal treasure, and borrowing from powerful nobles. He also began to rely more heavily on the justice system to raise funds, which led to widespread corruption and resentment. The situation worsened in the 1250s when Henry's government began to chafe. The arrival of the Lusignan brothers, his half-siblings, caused significant tension. William and Aymer de Valence were given important positions and lands, which caused widespread resentment. They were seen as arrogant, violent, and disrespectful, and they often bypassed royal justice. In 1256, Henry issued an order that writs against his favorites should not be acted upon, which violated the Magna Carta and further eroded trust in his rule. Henry's favoritism towards the Lusignans and his failure to provide fair justice were major issues. The barons began to see him as a tyrant, corrupting public authority for private interests. Henry's delusions of grandeur also played a role. He had taken the cross in 1250, dreaming of leading a vast army to recapture Jerusalem. However, his real obligations in Gascony and his financial struggles made this dream impossible. Instead, he shifted his focus to Sicily, where Pope Innocent IV was offering the crown. Henry saw this as a chance to reclaim a former Plantagenet land, combining his crusading ambitions with his desire to restore his inheritance. Despite his grand plans, Henry's reign was marked by financial struggles, political crises, and a growing sense of disillusionment among his subjects. His vision of kingship, while grand and holy, was ultimately undermined by his inability to manage his resources and govern effectively. Henry III's reign, which had begun with such promise, had become a story of missteps and miscalculations. His dreams of Sicily, grand and ambitious, had proven to be little more than a mirage. The kingdom of Sicily, once a glittering prize, had become a heavy burden, a symbol of his inability to manage the complex politics of his time. The barons, frustrated by Henry's ineptitude and his reckless spending, had reached their limit. They saw the king's schemes as nothing more than a series of impossible dreams that threatened to drag the kingdom into ruin. In 1258, the barons took matters into their own hands. On a spring morning, a group of powerful nobles, led by the Earl of Norfolk, the Earl of Gloucester, and Simon de Montfort, stormed into Westminster. They came not as rebels, but as men determined to save the kingdom from the king's poor judgment. With their swords left at the door, they presented a set of demands that would fundamentally change the way the kingdom was governed. Henry, caught off guard, was forced to agree. He and his son, Edward, swore oaths to abide by the new rules, which included the formation of a council of 15 barons to guide the king's decisions, and the appointment of a justiciar to ensure justice was served. The provisions of Oxford, as these reforms were known, aimed to address the widespread corruption and mismanagement that had plagued the kingdom. They established a system where 4 knights in each county would investigate abuses by royal officials, and a panel of 24 barons would oversee the government. The king's most trusted allies, the Lusignans, were expelled from the country, and Henry's role in governance was severely restricted. For the next 3 years, the barons, with Simon de Montfort at the forefront, took control of the kingdom's affairs. Henry, now a figurehead, turned to religion for solace. He visited shrines and churches, mourning the loss of his young daughter, Catherine, and seeking divine guidance in a world that seemed to have turned against him. The barons, meanwhile, continued their reform efforts, issuing the provisions of Westminster in 1259, which further refined the system of governance and law. By the end of 1259, Henry's influence had waned to the point of irrelevance. The once proud king was now a shadow of his former self, his ambitions for Sicily long forgotten. In December of that year, Henry traveled to Paris to meet with King Louis IX. The two kings, both deeply religious men, stood in the orchard of Louis's palace, surrounded by the bare branches of winter. Henry, kneeling before Louis, was a humbled monarch, a stark contrast to the ambitious ruler he had once been. The journey to Paris had been a long one, not just in distance, but in the trials and tribulations that had shaped Henry's reign. The barons' reforms, while necessary, had stripped him of his power, and the kingdom was now in the hands of those who had once been his subjects. Henry's legacy was one of a king who, despite his good intentions, had failed to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics. His reign was a cautionary tale of the dangers of dreaming too big, and the importance of listening to the counsel of one's advisors. As Henry knelt before Louis, the apple trees stood as silent witnesses to the end of an era. The kingdom of England, once torn by conflict and misrule, was on the path to a new beginning, one where the barons and the people would have a greater say in how their country was governed. The king's dreams of Sicily were nothing more than a distant memory, a reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the enduring need for wisdom and prudence in leadership.